Thank you for joining us for this webinar today. And today we're going to be talking about a new publication entitled Near-Infrared Spectroscopy Can be used to visualize the progression of wounds towards healing. And this is published in the October issue of the journal Wounds. So the goal of this study is to use near-infrared spectroscopy to identify patterns that predict when wounds might or might not heal. In this study, there was 25 subjects that had either diabetic foot ulcers or venous leg ulcers that were followed for distinctive patterns of tissue oxygenation. So I think this is an interesting study because we're really at the forefront of a new imaging technology. If you compare this to the historic X-ray or MRI studies, in the beginning, of course, people had no idea about what various disease states look like when you would image. So for example, here you can see an X-ray and an MRI of the same person, and this patient happens to have osteomyelitis of the distal medial head of the first metatarsal. And because we are familiar with MRIs and we're familiar with X-rays, we can see clearly on the MRI where there's this inflammatory response in the bone. So the idea of this study is to start studying the patterns that we see with near-infrared spectroscopy to try to see if we can get a handle on various disease pathologies, of course, but more importantly, try to get a handle on the signs that we might be able to observe to predict when a wound is or is not going to close. So as I said, the study design was with 25 subjects with either a diabetic foot ulcer or venous leg ulcer. And what we did was we looked at sequential images that were captured at each visit, regardless of how the wound was being managed. In other words, we were less interested in the treatments that were being used, but rather the progression towards or away from healing. So after we tracked the patients for a period of time, we then retrospectively went back and looked at the images. Now we know the results already. We know if the wound closed or did not close. And now we're looking for patterns that might give us a hint early on as to which wounds went on to heal later. So to be clear, we're not interested in the treatment per se that led to healing, but rather the patterns of tissue oxygenation that were associated with wound healing. Now, near-infrared spectroscopy is a technology that uses reflected light to determine the ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated hemoglobin. So when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, there's a subtle shift in the color that's reflected. And so the Kent device utilizes light that's transmitted and then reflected. And then based on the color of the light that's reflected, it takes a ratio and it can calculate the percentage of oxygenation in the tissues. Now, this is different from TCPO2 because with the Kent technology, you can look at the entire foot rather than a single spot. With transcutaneous oxygen perfusion, normally you have for example, a pulse oximeter is a TCPO2 device, and you can measure one spot on the tip of your finger. With the Kent snapshot device, you can look at the entire dorsal surface of the foot or the plantar surface or a large area that you're interested in imaging. And so you can see not only the wound, but the surrounding tissues. Now, when we look at traditional wound healing models, we typically look at this sort of three-phase model where you have inflammation initially, possibly following debridement, and then this leads to proliferation of cells and then ultimately remodeling of the tissues. When we look at wound healing with the near-infrared system, we start to see a slightly different pattern emerging. So in this study, we identified what we call HINT, hyperperfusion, inhibition, neovascularization, and trailing. So these are the patterns that we see as a wound progresses through the healing process. So with hyperperfusion, what we see is a buildup of saturated oxygen around the wound bed. This is followed by inhibition, where we start to see oxygen moving across the margins into the wound bed. Next, neovascularization, where there's a gradual drop-off from the wound perimeter because the center of the wound is now becoming much better oxygenated and perfused. And finally, trailing. This is sort of a a wispy-like breaking up of the areas surrounding the wound as the circulation matures. It corresponds with the remodeling phase of healing. So if we look at hyperperfusion around, which is this buildup of erythema, or if you will, in this case, oxygenation around the perimeter, in some cases, the wound never gets past this stage. So hyperperfusion that does not progress onto inhibition is a congested wound. This is a wound that has a lot of scar tissue. And so the oxygenation never crosses that red border. It just keeps getting brighter and brighter red. Constant inflammatory reaction without actual perfusion of the wound bed itself. Now, when we're talking about inhibition, this is where we start to see an exchange of fluids from outside going into the wound and vice versa. And so in this picture here, in picture A, clinically we have the appearance of a wound that is necrotic. You can see a lot of black eschar. But when we do the near infrared image, you can see that the vast majority of this wound bed is starting to become oxygenated. Then here you can see the red perimeter, and then you see the bluish central core. And you can actually put numbers on this. You can see how much oxygenation. So in this little lower area, you can see 59% oxygenation. Historically, we look for oxygenation levels greater than 40%, indicative of a wound that is starting to heal. And of course, you can see here in image D, the wound has progressed dramatically from number A to number D as it starts to heal. Finally, we get to neovascularization and what we call the trailing pattern. So with neovascularization, you start to see increased erythema, or I shouldn't say erythema, increased redness, indicative of increased oxygenation in this center portion of the wound. And now, if you look a little bit further out, you see this is what we call the trailing pattern, sort of a wispiness in the perimeter around the wound. And this is when things are starting to normalize. The wound is well on its way to healing. And these wounds almost always will go ahead and complete the cycle and go on to heal. As part of this study, we began to try to classify these various signs to try to give grades as to which wounds might heal and which wounds might not heal. And here you can see, we look at the ratio of wound bed oxygenation to peri-wound oxygenation, and we've graded them. And the grades can be looked at from the near infrared appearance as well as the clinical appearance. And these are our grades. Excellent for grade 1. This is a wound that will probably go on to heal. Poor, grade 2, fair, and good. So to conclude, there appear to be specific identifiable patterns of not only the wound, but also the peri-wound oxygenation areas. And this helps us, we believe, to predict a wound's ability to close. Now, this evaluation process is in its infancy, and further refinement is clearly still needed. This is a very small sample size of only 25 wounds, but already we're starting to see some simple patterns emerging. One nice thing about this system also is that this is the system that will allow us to compensate for skin pigmentation. In previous iterations of near-infrared spectroscopy, we were rarely able to go to wounds and skin tones above a Fitzpatrick 3. With the new algorithm from the Kent snapshot system, we can now go to a Fitzpatrick 6. Much darker skin tones allow us to get a much more accurate picture of how the tissues in the wound and in the peri-wound area have been oxygenated. So I'm very excited about this technology. I think this is a whole new realm of imaging that we can now use as a tool to help us predict and understand why wounds heal and why they might not heal. If you'd like more information, or if you have any questions or thoughts, or if you've observed some patterns of your own that you'd like to share, please feel free to contact me. Here's my email address. You can also read more about the Kent snapshot device at woundsresearch.com. Thank you very much for your attention.